Marcus didn't believe in luck. 40 years of working 2 jobs, of showing up before sunrise and leaving after dark, of teaching his 3 children that character was the only currency that never depreciated. Luck had nothing to do with any of it. But on a Tuesday evening in March, sitting in a fluorescent-lit convenience store with a lottery ticket in his trembling hand and a clerk confirming numbers that couldn't possibly be right, Marcus discovered that belief and reality were sometimes strangers. $8.2 million. After taxes, after fees, after the state took its cut. Still enough to rewrite the narrative he'd been living for 58 years. Enough to stop working. Enough to give his children what he'd never been able to give them. Choices, freedom. The kind of future where struggle wasn't the default setting. He sat in his truck in the parking lot for 2 hours, the ticket folded against his palm, imagining how this moment would reshape everything. He thought about Sarah, his middle child, working 3 part-time jobs to put herself through community college. He thought about Emma, his youngest, postponing her own dreams to help him cover rent. He thought about James, his eldest, who had stopped calling as often, who seemed to be moving through the world like someone carrying something too heavy to name. When Marcus finally drove home to the small house he'd owned for 23 years, the one with the leaking roof he kept patching instead of replacing, the one with the kitchen linoleum that had faded to the color of old bone, he knew this money would change his family. He didn't yet know it would shatter them. The conversation happened at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning. All 3 children home at the same time was rare enough that Marcus knew they'd sense something significant. He laid the ticket down between the salt shaker and the coffee pot, watching their faces transform from confusion to shock to a kind of luminous disbelief that made his chest ache. James was the first to speak, laughing in that way people laugh when reality becomes too large to process. Sarah started crying immediately. Emma kept saying no, 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 as if repetition could unmake the truth. "We're going to be okay," Marcus said quietly. "All of us." Finally. He'd prepared the words carefully. He'd spent the previous evening with a financial advisor, understanding the numbers, the investments, the way money could be distributed to create lasting security. The plan was simple in its generosity. Each child would receive enough to change their circumstances: a down payment on a house, an education completed without debt, the freedom to choose work that mattered rather than work that paid. But there was something else. Something Marcus had decided in the hours before the lottery drawing, when he'd felt the weight of that ticket like a physical thing, like a choice already made by forces larger than himself. He hadn't told the financial advisor everything. He'd kept one piece of the plan private, locked behind a door that only he could open. When he explained it to his children that morning, the light in the kitchen shifted. Or perhaps it didn't. Perhaps the light was the same, and it was only the faces looking back at him that changed. "I'm going to give most of it to James," Marcus said. The words fell into the room like something heavy, like something that broke on impact. Sarah stopped crying. Emma stopped saying no. James, who had been smiling that luminous smile, put his hand down on the table and looked at his father like he was trying to read something written in a language he'd almost forgotten. "What?" Sarah's voice was small, smaller than a middle daughter should sound. "What do you mean, most of it?" Marcus had practiced this explanation too. He'd stood in front of the mirror in his bedroom, watching his own face age under the weight of the words he was about to say. He'd tried to find a way to make it sound fair, reasonable, like the decision of a loving father rather than a man operating on knowledge he couldn't share. "James needs it," Marcus said. "I have reasons for this choice, and I'm asking you to trust me." "Trust you?" Emma's voice cracked. "Dad, are you serious? You won the lottery and you're giving it to James? What about me? What about Sarah?" "You'll both be secure, college funds, enough to get started. But James needs—" Marcus stopped. He couldn't finish the sentence. He couldn't say the thing he'd discovered 6 months ago. The thing that had changed how he looked at his eldest son forever. James needs what? Sarah leaned forward, and her face was a mirror of every disappointment she'd ever absorbed. "Because it looks like James needs to be your favorite, and we need to understand why." Marcus didn't answer. He couldn't. If he opened his mouth, everything would spill out. The phone call at 3 in the morning, the desperation in James's voice, the realization that his son had been drowning in a way that money from a working father could never fix. The nights Marcus had lain awake calculating how much his son would have needed to reach rock bottom, how much longer he could have lasted on the wages from 2 jobs, how many more months before the choice between intervention and funeral. But he'd made a promise to James, a silent promise made without words but understood in the way fathers and sons sometimes understand things that can't be spoken aloud. "I'm trusting you to trust me," Marcus said finally. "That's all I can ask." It wasn't enough. Of course it wasn't enough. The months that followed were like watching a family photograph develop in reverse, the clarity fading until all that remained were shadows. Sarah moved out faster than she'd planned, finding a roommate situation with a coworker, putting distance between herself and a father whose love apparently had conditions she didn't meet. Emma withdrew differently. She stopped talking about her own struggles, stopped asking for advice, stopped coming to Sunday dinners. She built a wall made of polite distance and practiced smiles that never quite reached her eyes. James, for his part, received the money with a gratitude so profound it bordered on spiritual. He set up meetings with the financial advisor. He made decisions about what the money meant, how it would be used. And he never, not once, asked his father why. That silence was its own kind of understanding. The years moved forward. Sarah finished her degree, got a stable job, bought a modest house with the down payment her father had given her. She was successful by any reasonable measure. But there was a tightness in her smile when she talked about family, a way of laughing that sounded like resignation. She married a kind man who knew better than to ask too many questions about her relationship with her father. She had 2 daughters, whom she loved fiercely and equally, and she made a quiet decision that when they were old enough, she would explain to them that sometimes parents made choices that had nothing to do with how much they loved you. Emma took a different path. She traveled for a few years working jobs that kept her moving, that kept her from staying in one place long enough to feel the absence of something she couldn't name. She eventually settled in a different city entirely, far enough away that visits home required planning and intention. She became someone who excelled at surface relationships, at being pleasant and present without ever being truly vulnerable. She built a life of independence that looked like strength, but felt like armor. And James. James used the money in ways that neither Marcus nor his siblings understood at first. He paid off debts that no one knew he had. He checked himself into a treatment facility for 6 months. He built a life of recovery, of restoration, of the kind of slow, painful work that money alone could never accomplish but could make possible. He became a different kind of man, not the version he would have become if he'd had to work 3 jobs while trying to save himself, not the version who would have eventually failed, but a version reconstructed, rebuilt, learning to forgive himself for the person he'd been when everything was falling apart. The distance between the 3 siblings grew like something alive. They saw each other at Christmas sometimes, at birthdays when schedules aligned. But the easy connection they'd once had, the way siblings raised by a single father sometimes understand each other without words, that was gone, replaced by something more cautious, more carefully bounded. They talked around the elephant in the room so skillfully that after a while, the elephant began to feel like furniture, like something that had always been there. Marcus watched all of this from his own life. He'd left his job after the lottery as planned. He worked part-time as a consultant, something minimal that kept him engaged but didn't consume him. He volunteered at the youth center. He became the kind of man people called kind and generous, not knowing that his kindness came from a place of deep, carrying knowledge about what damage looked like, what drowning sounded like, how close his son had come to a finish line he would never cross if Marcus hadn't been standing at the gate with a key. He wanted to tell them. Not to justify himself, he'd made his peace with the fact that justification would look like excuse-making, but to help them understand that love sometimes operated on knowledge that the beloved didn't possess, that a father's job sometimes was to make choices that would make no sense until much later, or perhaps never, that the gap between how he'd distributed the money and how his daughters had interpreted that distribution was the distance between two different truths, and both could be real at the same time. But the years had a way of cementing things. Distance became routine. Silence became habit. And Marcus, watching his 3 children navigate adulthood without the closeness they might have had, carried the weight of that knowledge like a stone in his chest. If you're from a city where families have been torn apart by misunderstanding, comment where you're from. So many of us are watching the people we love from a distance and wondering why. 20 years passed. 2 decades of Christmases and birthdays, of phone calls that never quite said what needed to be said, of a family held together by obligation and love but not by closeness. Sarah's daughters grew into young women who'd learned from their mother that fathers were people who cared but couldn't quite be trusted with your whole heart. Emma's professional success became legendary. She was promoted again, became someone important in her field. But her personal life remained carefully curated, a place where people could visit but never quite stay. James built his recovery into purpose, becoming a counselor himself, helping other people climb out of the places he'd climbed out of, and his siblings watched from a distance and wondered if he'd built his redemption or been given it. Marcus aged in the way single fathers sometimes do, faster than their peers, as if the years of carrying responsibility had compounded interest on his bones. At 78, he moved slower. His hands shook in ways they hadn't before. He'd had a heart surgery, minor but significant, and he'd felt something shift in him, a sense that his time for waiting was ending. It was Emma who called first. Not about their father, but about her own life falling apart. Her marriage, the polite one to the kind man, had ended. Not explosively, but slowly, in the way some things die when no one is willing to be vulnerable enough to fight for them. She called Marcus on a Tuesday evening, and he heard something in her voice that he recognized, because he'd heard it once before, in James's voice, the night his eldest son had called at 3 a.m. to say he couldn't do it anymore. "I think I've been angry at you for 20 years, Emma said without preamble, "and I think that anger has made me afraid to love anyone the way I should. And I think—" She stopped. "Dad, I think I need to understand why you did it." Sarah found out through the family group chat that Emma was coming home. Not for a visit, not for a weekend, coming home to stay in their father's house for an indefinite period while she figured out what came next. She called Marcus immediately, her voice tight with something that might have been concern and might have been resentment and might have been both. "Is everything okay?" she asked. "Emma needs to be here," Marcus said, "and I need to tell you all something." He called James last. His eldest son answered on the second ring, and before Marcus could even speak, James said, "Is this about the money?" "It's about the money," Marcus confirmed. "It's about why I gave it the way I did." They arranged a time, a Saturday afternoon, neutral territory that was actually Marcus's kitchen, which had never been neutral, which held every conversation they'd ever had, and every conversation they'd avoided. Sarah came first, walking through the door like someone entering a crime scene looking for evidence. Emma was already there, making coffee with the familiarity of someone who'd grown up in this kitchen, who'd made 10,000 cups of coffee in this space, who knew where everything was kept. James arrived last, and he moved slowly, like a man walking toward something he'd been preparing for his entire life. Marcus sat at the kitchen table, the same table where he'd told them about the lottery 20 years ago. He looked at his 3 children, at Sarah's guarded expression, at Emma's swollen eyes, at James's steady gaze, and he felt the weight of 2 decades shift. "I need to tell you what I never told you," Marcus said, "and I need you to listen without interrupting, because I'll lose my nerve if I don't say it all at once. Have you ever had information about someone you love that would break them if you revealed it? Comment if you've carried that kind of secret." Sarah sat down. Emma stopped moving. James reached over and put his hand on their father's shoulder, and Marcus understood in that gesture that his eldest son already knew this was coming. 6 months before the lottery, Marcus began, James called me. It was 3 a.m. He was at a bridge, not on it, but close enough that I understood what he was thinking. And he said to me, "Dad, I can't do this anymore." He didn't mean he couldn't live his life. He meant he couldn't live in his body with what he'd done to himself, with the person he'd become. Sarah's hand went to her mouth. Emma went very still. I don't know all of it, Marcus continued. I know he had addiction. I know he'd lost money he didn't have. I know he'd burned through friends, relationships, every safety net he'd ever built. I know he'd tried to quit, tried to get help, tried everything he could reach from the bottom of the hole he was in, and nothing worked. And he called me because I was the only person left he thought might understand. Marcus paused. In that pause was 20 years. In that pause was every moment he'd watched his eldest son rebuild himself, every recovery meeting James had attended, every time he'd come out the other side of wanting to die and chosen to live instead. I told him we'd figure it out, Marcus said, and then I got a lottery ticket. And I understood immediately what that ticket meant. It meant I could save my son's life. James was crying now, silently, the way men who've learned to contain themselves sometimes cry, in a way that barely disturbs the surface of their face but comes from somewhere deeper than tears usually reach. The money wasn't for success, Marcus said. It was for survival. I gave it to James with conditions he understood without me having to say them. It was tied to treatment, to recovery, to the kind of work that costs everything but builds you back into a human being. If I'd told you, if I'd explained it, you would have known what James had been struggling with. And he didn't need your pity. He needed your silence and your love. He needed to become someone new without everyone watching the ways he'd failed. Sarah's face had gone through several transformations. Anger to confusion to something that looked like understanding, then back to anger again. You let us think he was your favorite, she said quietly. You let us believe you'd chosen him over us. I know, Marcus said, and I'm sorry for that, but I would make the same choice again. If my son was drowning, I would give him everything. I would give him the lottery. I would give him my life. I would give him the future he was about to lose. And if that meant you felt less loved, then I was willing to carry that weight. Because the alternative was burying him. Emma was shaking her head, not in disagreement but in the way people shake their heads when something they've believed for 2 decades suddenly rearranges itself. Why didn't you tell us? She asked. Why did you let us resent you? Because your resentment was safer than your pity, Marcus said. Because love that comes from knowledge about someone's worst moment is different from love that's chosen freely. James needed to believe he was chosen for something, not rescued from destruction. And you needed to believe your father loved you according to his own values, not according to your brother's crisis. Sarah stood up. She walked to the window, looking out at the yard where all 3 of them had played as children, where Marcus had taught them to ride bicycles, where he'd stood watching them learn the world. When she turned back, her face was older. I've made decisions about how I raise my daughters based on what I learned from you, she said. I've taught them to divide love equally, to never show preference, to treat each child as if they were identical. I've made myself into the opposite of what I thought you were. And you're telling me that you were doing something I would have done too if I'd known. I'm telling you that love isn't always equal, Marcus said. Sometimes it's proportional to need. Sometimes it looks unfair because we're not seeing the whole picture. And sometimes a parent has to make a choice that will seem wrong until the moment it suddenly makes sense. James spoke for the first time. His voice was rough, as if he'd been using it to cry even though his face had been silent. I've spent 20 years thinking about this money, he said, about what it meant, about what Dad risked to give it to me. I've thought about killing myself every single day for 5 years after he gave it to me, and then every other day for 5 years after that. I've thought about it less and less until now it's maybe once a month, just a ghost of an old impulse. This money didn't save my life because it was money. It saved my life because it meant my father believed I was worth saving. He looked at his sisters. You were never less loved, he said. You were just less dying. The silence that followed was different from all the silences that had come before. It wasn't empty. It was full. It was the sound of something breaking and something healing happening at the same time. They talked for hours. Not all the anger went away. Not all the resentment dissolved into understanding. But the wall that had stood between Marcus and his daughters, between the siblings who'd been separated by a secret they couldn't see, began to crack. They talked about what love looks like when it has to make impossible choices. They talked about what it means to be a parent and to know things about your children that would destroy them if revealed. They talked about the version of James they would have been if Marcus hadn't made the choice he made, and all three of them understood, in the quiet way understanding sometimes comes, that it would have been a funeral instead of a recovery. By evening, Sarah was crying, but differently. Emma was holding her father's hand. James was making dinner, the way he used to do when they were all young and their father was still working 2 jobs, before the lottery, before the secret, before the divide. They ate together at the kitchen table where the invisible weight had finally become visible, and visible things, after all, can finally be understood. If you've ever had to forgive your parents for making choices in secret that you thought were about you, comment below. So many of us are still learning what love looks like when it operates on knowledge we didn't have. Marcus lived for 5 more years after that conversation. 5 years of his children slowly, tentatively, learning how to be close again. Sarah visited with her daughters, teaching them that justice and fairness weren't the same thing, that love could be expressed in infinite languages, that a grandfather who'd made hard choices in secret was still a grandfather worth knowing. Emma found her way back to vulnerability slowly, like someone relearning a language she'd almost forgotten. She didn't remarry, but she stopped building walls. She became the kind of person who could say, "I need help," and mean it. James became even more devoted to his recovery work, eventually writing a memoir about addiction and survival that would reach thousands of people trying to climb out of their own holes. In the acknowledgments, he thanked his father for the greatest act of love I have ever known, knowing when to save me and how to do it in a way that let me save myself. On the last day of Marcus's life, all 3 of them were there. He'd had another heart attack, and this one was final. He was 83 years old, and he'd lived long enough to see his children reconcile, long enough to see his family put itself back together, long enough to know that the choice he'd made in secret had led not to division, but to a kind of understanding that only comes when love is tested and found, finally, to be enough. "Thank you," Sarah said, holding his hand. "For what?" Marcus asked, even though he knew. "For loving us enough to break us," she said, "and for waiting for us to understand why you had to." Marcus died that evening. He died knowing that his greatest act wasn't the lottery, wasn't the money, wasn't even saving his son's life. His greatest act was trusting that if he could hold the weight of the secret long enough, if he could bear to be misunderstood, if he could love his children even when that love looked like betrayal, that eventually, they would understand that the most invisible sacrifices are sometimes the ones that matter most. Have a story about a parent making a choice you didn't understand until years later? Share it with us. We want to hear about the moments when love finally became clear. At the funeral, 3 siblings stood side by side. They were no longer separated by a secret, but they were forever connected by the knowledge of it. They understood now what their father had understood all along, that a family is strongest, not when love is equal, but when it's distributed according to need. That the most beautiful relationships are the ones built in silence, in secret, in the willingness of a parent to be misunderstood, in service of a child's survival. Years passed. Sarah told her daughters the full story, and they grew into women who understood that love could be complicated, that fairness and justice weren't the same thing, that sometimes the people we love most need the kinds of help we can never see. Emma eventually became a therapist, dedicating her work to helping families navigate the gaps between what love looks like and what it actually costs. She named her practice Invisible Sacrifice, and her office was filled with people trying to understand the choices their parents had made, the money, the secrets, the ways love sometimes had to operate in the dark. James lived a long life in recovery. He never relapsed. He never returned to the bridge. He became a grandfather, and he told his grandchildren stories about their great-grandfather, about a man who'd worked 2 jobs for 40 years, about a man who'd had the courage to let his other children misunderstand him in order to save the one who was dying. He taught his grandchildren that character was the only inheritance that mattered, that a father's job was sometimes to carry burdens in silence, that the greatest acts of love often look like the greatest acts of betrayal until you finally understand them. And perhaps that's the real story. Not the lottery, not the money, not even the addiction and the recovery. The real story is about what a father will do, what he will sacrifice, what he will endure, in order to make sure his children know, if not immediately, then eventually, that he would have given them everything. He would have given them his silence. He would have given them his reputation. He would have given them the pain of misunderstanding, because the alternative was giving them a funeral. Know a single dad whose quiet choices changed his family forever? Tell us his story. Include his city and what he sacrificed that no one understood. Send it to us. We want to celebrate the fathers who love in the dark, whose greatest acts of protection often look like something else entirely. Marcus never knew how many people his story would touch. He never knew that his choice, made in secret, in the middle of the night at a kitchen table in a house with a leaking roof, would eventually reverberate through the lives of thousands of people trying to understand what their own parents had done, why they'd made the choices they'd made, whether they could forgive them for loving unequally. But that's often how grace works. It moves quietly. It operates in the dark. It asks us to trust something we can't see. And then, years later, when we finally understand, we realize that we've been held the entire time. If you're a single dad watching this, knowing something about one of your children that the others don't know, carry it with the weight of knowing that someday they might understand. Carry it with grace. Carry it knowing that the misunderstanding now is temporary, and the understanding, when it comes, will be worth everything.